Hey squad, welcome back, and if you're new here, welcome to the channel. Today I want to examine the virtue Tolkien called Northern Courage, and how it influences the beliefs and decisions of Theoden and Denethor. Tolkien describes Northern Courage as the doctrine of uttermost endurance in the service of indomitable will. Elements of this quality are represented in ancient and classical epics from many cultures. However, Tolkien found it prominently featured in the often grim legends of Northern Europe, particularly Old English literature, which was one of his specialties. It's easy to see how Northern Courage, which transforms the despair of defeat into a poignant glory, is related to another theme important to Tolkien, the concept of Estel, a Sindarin term describing a kind of radical hope in the face of certain defeat. While Tolkien might argue that its highest expressions approach Estel, Northern Courage itself has a dark side. In an essay commenting on the Anglo-Saxon poetic fragment called The Battle of Maldon, Tolkien describes the way the unnamed author criticizes an earl's choice to honorably allow invading Vikings to cross a causeway and array themselves for battle, even though this proves disastrous tactically. The defiant fearlessness of the deed has an undeniable appeal, spurring one of the Earl's retainers to observe, "Thought shall be harder, heart the keener, mood the more as our might lessens." Tolkien notes these lines are often considered a pure expression of the principle of Northern Courage. However, Tolkien argues, the poet does not give wholehearted approval to this choice. He recognizes its nobility, but also the selfish pride that motivates it. Something similar can be found in Tolkien's characterization of Éowyn. Seeing no hope of glory or satisfaction in her appointed task of remaining behind to shepherd the civilians, Éowyn leaves her people and defies Theoden's will to ride alongside him in secret. Along with her devotion to her uncle and the compassion she has shown to Merry, her fatalism allows her to achieve the heroic deed she's long desired. Not only does she challenge and defeat the Lord of the Nazgul, but she lives to tell about it. However, she finds no satisfaction in the renown she's gained, and until Faramir helps restore her ability to take pleasure in life, she remains sunk in despair. And while Theoden's heroic death moves Éomer to bittersweet pride, the discovery of Éowyn's apparently lifeless body spurs him and his men into a headlong, death-seeking fury, to the needless cost of many lives. Éowyn's deed is one of the purest expressions of Northern Courage in the book, yet Tolkien critiques it by showing how even its most awe-inspiring successes are hollow in themselves. Such courage must be directed toward a positive end to be meaningful. We can see more evidence of this in the characters of Denethor and Theoden, both of whom display a degree of fearless resolve in the face of inescapable doom. As Minas Tirith crumbles before them, taking with it any hope of resisting Sauron, and the black breath of the Nazgul weakens the city's remaining defenders, both men are filled with a kind of reckless madness, as they realize the only real choice left to them is determining the time and manner of their own deaths. Denethor turns this opportunity into an expression of nihilism, spite, and arrogance, filling those around him with doubt and horror. Theoden, on the other hand, makes as courageous and inspirational an end as it is possible to imagine, giving both his riders and the Knights of Gondor renewed strength. While defiant self-determination in the face of death is the most visible component of Northern Courage, the fullest expression of this value requires a particular kind of historical consciousness. One that might just make someone more likely to display radical hope and trust when confronted with overwhelming devastation. Such a value encourages an attitude toward the past that paradoxically places greater importance on the deeds and decisions of the present. Despite their many similarities, Theoden and Denethor consistently show contrasting attitudes toward their place in history, and these attitudes determine how the virtue of Northern Courage is expressed in their respective deaths. Now, I am by no means a qualified expert in the literature or culture of the Anglo-Saxons, but it seems to me that the typical formulation of Northern Courage is much more focused on the quality of a deed than on its outcome. What makes the line from the Battle of Maldon such a banger, if you'll pardon the anachronism, is that the speaker fully embraces not just the likelihood but the certainty of defeat. He says they will fight all the harder because they know they have no hope of winning, and thus their deaths will be extra glorious. One idea underlying this claim is the recognition that mortal men rarely get a chance to impact the world after their inevitable deaths. One of the only good ways to do so is to leave a legacy of heroic fame. Since everyone's going to die eventually anyway, it's more important for one's deeds to be notable and honorable than it is to win or even survive. This way, your name at least will be immortalized, alongside those of the legendary heroes who have inspired your own life. Deriving meaning from this kind of framework requires one to respect one's ancestors for both the traditions they've handed down and the greatness they demonstrated in their own contexts. Theoden takes pride in his ancestors, but remains humble himself in relationship to them. He sees the examples of his forefathers as a standard to live up to rather than proof of his own greatness. When Saruman attempts to flatter and manipulate him with references to his lineage, he names himself a lesser son of great sires, but says that doesn't mean he has to grovel for Saruman's approval. And as he dies, he tells Merry that he is going to his long sleep with his fathers, and because of his deeds, even in their mighty company I shall not now be ashamed. Denethor, on the other hand, is very attached to the way things are in his time, and while he's very proud to be the last surviving representative of the traditions of Numenor, he also seems to value his ancestors and their traditions more for what they have produced for his benefit than for their own sake. His contempt for the prospect of a returning king has less to do with the legitimacy of Aragorn's claim, and more to do with how long it's been since Isildur's line, which is technically the Elder One, was in any position to influence Gondor. I am steward of the House of Anarion. I will not step down to be the dotard chamberlain of an upstart. Even were his claim proved to me, still he comes but of the line of Isildur. I will not bow to such a one, last of a ragged house, long bereft of lordship and dignity. In choosing the manner of his death, Denethor explicitly does not want to join his forefathers. No tomb for Denethor and Faramir, no long, slow sleep of death embalmed. We will burn like heathen kings before ever a ship sailed hither from the west. This comment is doubly significant. With Minas Tirith literally crumbling around him, Denethor no longer cares whether he's entombed with his predecessors or not. He considers their legacy, which is also his, to now be pointless. His words show some contempt for the heathen kings that predated Numenor's quote-unquote civilizing influence, but he's also choosing their, funeral rites over those of his own culture, demonstrating that he believes the lives of all his ancestors, Númenórean and otherwise, to be as futile as he deems his own choices now. These different relationships to history also show up in the characters' approaches to the future, including to those who may survive them. We know that Theoden and Denethor have both dealt with conflict with their surviving heirs. At the height of Theoden's despondency, his nephew Éomer actually gets arrested for defying his commands. Upon shaking off the influence of the treacherous counselor Grima, Theoden repents of this, saying, "Faithful heart may have froward tongue." And this description seems to fit Éomer very well even after the two have reconciled. Éomer is not shy about voicing his doubts, and while Theoden is determined to follow his own will, he doesn't blame Éomer for coming to different conclusions. This is important because with Theodred's death, Éomer is now Theoden's heir, and likely to become king much sooner than anyone really wants. Yet despite their differences of opinion, Theoden continues to call Éomer his son, and with his final words he hails Éomer as the king of the Mark. Theoden is able to surrender his control over the future, trusting that Éomer will make the best decisions he's capable of, even though some of those decisions will surely be different than the ones Theoden would make himself. Denethor really struggles with this, despite having far less cause to. In addition to being his heir, Faramir is his biological son, and he's very similar to Denethor in temperament and intelligence. Faramir's also much more deferential than Éomer, seeming able to respect the office of the steward and the importance of presenting a united front, despite his personal conflicts with his father. Unfortunately, this does not assuage Denethor's mistrust, and when Faramir dares voice a concern about one of the steward's tactical decisions, he makes the decision in question a test of Faramir's loyalty. This, of course, ends up with Faramir being seriously wounded, which begins Denethor's downward spiral, though it's noteworthy that he only starts demonstrating his care and concern for Faramir after Faramir is rendered incapable of offering any criticism or difference of opinion. In preparing to immolate his son alongside himself, he says he simply wants them not to be parted in death. I don't mean to suggest that he's intentionally lying here. Denethor and Faramir do seem to genuinely care for each other, albeit sometimes in a breathtakingly dysfunctional way. But it is interesting that Denethor's actions would eliminate any chance that Faramir might outlive him and assume the role of steward in turn. Denethor tells Gandalf he most wants to leave my chair to a son after me, who would be his own master and no wizard's pupil. In reality, it seems that Denethor wants his son to act as a pure extension of his will after his own death. This also gives some context to why he's so cut up over Boromir's death, fixated on the fact that Boromir would have deferred to Denethor's wishes rather than trying to use his own judgment. Theoden's attitude allows him to follow his own will while also placing full confidence in those who will outlive him, surrendering his control over the future. We can see this paradoxical outlook as another product of Northern courage and the culture that surrounds it. For one thing, it's very compatible with the emphasis on the deeds of the present over their actual outcomes. In politics and in war, Theoden's more concerned about making the right move now than he is about whether his plans will bear fruit after he's gone. It also provides a framework for what kind of influence Theoden can hope to have on future generations. He is meant to inspire them, as the heroes of old inspired him. The broadly applicable virtues he exemplifies will be far more meaningful than the exact opinions and policies he pursued in his own time. Finally, we should remember that Rohan, like many historical societies in pre-Christian Europe, was primarily an oral culture rather than a written one. This means that whatever legacy Theoden can hope to hand on will necessarily be filtered through the perspective of those who tell his story. He has responsibility for his people, but he is also dependent on them, for it is they who will determine how he is remembered. Denethor's situation doesn't really set him up for success the same way Theoden's does. The very things that make Gondor great, its crucial importance as a bulwark against Mordor, its high culture and deep lore, and not least its renowned written archives, make for a greater sense of mastery over history itself. In a city that houses Isildur's account of the finding of the ruling ring written in his own hand, it's natural that Denethor would expect to be able to define his legacy on his own terms. And when all of history points to the survival of Gondor and its traditions as being central to the fate of the entire world, it becomes very difficult to see the point of a world in which Gondor is either destroyed or changed beyond recognition. There are loyal and patriotic Gondorians with a decidedly different perspective. Faramir, with his famous declaration that he loves Gondor for the lore and nobility it has preserved rather than its military power, is one. Another is Beregond, who will end up defying Denethor's insane orders in order to protect Faramir. While Beregond and Pippin are looking out from the walls, they both suffer dread at the distant approach of a Nazgul. But as they shake off the effects, Beregond affirms, "Nay, though all things must come utterly to an end in time, Gondor shall not perish yet. Hope and memory shall live still in some hidden valley where the grass is green." This prospect, which should be encouraging, fills Denethor with horror and disgust, as he predicts that mean folk shall rule the last remnant of the kings of men, lurking in the hills until all are hounded out. The usual formulation of Denethor's fatal flaw focuses on his elevation of Gondor over other states and peoples. In notes on a review of his novel that referenced the role of politics in the story, Tolkien wrote, "Denethor was tainted with mere politics, hence his failure and his mistrust of Faramir. It had become for him a prime motive to preserve the polity of Gondor, as it was, against another potentate. Denethor despised lesser men, and one may be sure he did not distinguish between orcs and the allies of Mordor." In the novel, this idea is represented in Denethor's words to Gandalf. "The Lord of Gondor is not to be made the tool of other men's purposes, however worthy. And to him there is no purpose higher in the world, as it now stands, than the good of Gondor. And the rule of Gondor, my lord, is mine and no other man's, unless the king should come again." In both cases, it's clear that Denethor places Gondor above everything else, and while that is potentially problematic, it's also kind of his job. It's also a concern that's currently shared by everyone, from Theoden to Aragorn to Gandalf himself. They all recognize that if they are to have even a faint hope of defeating Sauron for good, the survival of Gondor is crucial. It's also not clear why, if Denethor's flaw was valuing Gondor over the rest of the world, the headlong desperation of his final moments would drive him to abandon his city to its fate, rather than directing his defiance toward those who would take the rule of Gondor from him, be that Mordor or Gandalf or the arriving Corsairs, in some final sacrifice or last stand that might have been disastrous, but would also likely have been highly awesome. But an overlooked part in both quotes is the identification of Gondor's present state, Gondor as it was, above which nothing in the world as it now stands could be more important. As often as Gandalf speaks of a concern for other nations and peoples, he also mentions other lives and times still to be. And when Gandalf asks the maddened Denethor what it is that he wants, Denethor replies, "I would have things as they were in all the days of my life." No matter the outcome of the battle, Denethor can't stop time or control the future, and this leaves him with nothing to hope for. As Gandalf comments with Denethor's passing, so pass also the days of Gondor that you have known. For good or evil, they are ended. The real narrowness of Denethor's perspective isn't just a political or geographic one, it's also temporal. Despite his overwhelming grief and dread, Theoden's attitude toward history allows him to at least entertain the possibility that the end of the world he's known might be for good. For him, the past is a source of inspiration rather than entitlement, and he is capable of making sacrifices for the sake of the future without asserting ownership or control over it. The historical solipsism fostered in part by Gondor's legitimate greatness, on the other hand, doesn't leave much scope for people like Denethor to find meaning in the present when they are certain that whatever the future brings, it will be catastrophic. In order to transcend the hollow fey bravery born of despair, and truly make an end worthy of song, Denethor would have to care more about those doing the singing than about what words they might use. If you enjoyed this video, remember to spur your cursor to the like button and hew it down so that it's standard founders. Consider subscribing if you'd like to hear more about Denethor and Theoden, since I've got some more to say about them. On top of that, bonus material on the relationship of Northern Courage and Estelle will be available through my Patreon page, along with other perks like a Discord and voting rights on topics like this one. Thank you to everyone for watching, and special thanks to my patrons, including John H. Austin Jr., Gandalf the Grey, Marcel Ribeiro, Nick Riallo, Jeremy Buckingham, Bitso Bongo, Dorwin Gray, Kevin Gilstat, Brendan Mooney, E. Rose B., Allison Kreutzberg, Frankie 12-String, Luke, Joel Bion, Rogue Hot Pocket, and Jared Carver. Until next time, remember to comport yourself in a way that would make your descendants as proud as your ancestors.